Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. This for the week of the 1st to 7th of March 2021, and this the second episode of the Hong Kong Quarantine Edition. I have not moved from this chair since last week. Before getting into our episode, we would like to send a special shout out to our friends at Go Taikonauts and Spacewatch.global. In particular, our friend Jacqueline from Go Taikonauts for having kept me company for an hour and a half earlier today on a phone call during quarantine. That definitely helped my Sunday afternoon go by a bit faster. So we have a few different updates for you this week. This includes an announcement by China Rocket on the Jielong-3 rocket to be developed over the next couple of years. An interesting article from regarding the Beijing space ecosystem and some of the different sub-ecosystems within Beijing. But first, we bring you an update on Chinese satellite manufacturer Qiansheng Exploration and their recent funding round.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored to welcome you aboard the Dongfang Hour. Please make sure your seatbelt is securely fastened. Thank you.
女士们、先生们，预计空中飞行时间2小时15分钟，我们预计在当地时间下午6点25分左右到达。
The first piece of news from this week is a Series A funding round by Qiansheng Exploration, also known as QST. So Qiansheng Exploration, earlier this week on March 5th, they announced a Series A funding round of more than 100 million RMB. The funding is expected to strengthen the company's satellite manufacturing and geospatial information services capabilities. Most of this money has come from the Fuzhou Jiangxi High-Tech Emerging Industry Development Fund, which is apparently part of the Fuzhou National High-Tech Industrial Zone. This round of funding is noteworthy for a couple of different reasons. So the first one is that Qiansheng Exploration, which is headquartered in Beijing, it was founded in Beijing, they have previously had a quite close relationship with the Zhongguancun area government of Beijing. And we've mentioned Zhongguancun in a couple of previous episodes. It's this sort of, it's not a district, but it's an area, let's say, of Beijing that is home to a lot of different high-tech companies. And again, Qiansheng, they have previously had quite close relations with Zhongguancun. We don't necessarily think this has changed with this funding round, but the fact that the funding round is led by a development fund from the city of Fuzhou likely implies that Qiansheng is going to relocate some of the activity to the city as a form of kind of economic development. And indeed, we did see in an interview later on in the week that the company does plan to build a teleport in Jiangxi, which is the province of Fuzhou. So also noteworthy here is, in fact, the city of Fuzhou. And this was an interesting experience earlier this week. So full disclosure, I'm a geography buff, and I've lived in China for 10 years. I've heard of a lot of different Chinese cities. And when I heard Fuzhou, I assumed that this was Fuzhou, the capital of Fujian province. So, probably the 20th largest city in China. And I thought, well, Fuzhou, Fujian province, that's kind of a random city for a space company. But as it turns out, no, this is Fuzhou Jiangxi province, so a different Fuzhou, and that would make it the 4th or 5th largest city in China's 14th, roughly, largest province. So this, yeah, I mean, I had never heard of Fuzhou Jiangxi province before, despite being a geography nut that has lived in China for 10 years. So the fact that Fuzhou Jiangxi province is leading this round of funding into a commercial space company was an interesting development. And so I did a little bit of digging on Fuzhou to see what's going on in Fuzhou that might support a commercial space ecosystem. And what I found on Wikipedia is that Fuzhou, the main industries are food processing, textiles, and then food, which implicitly is agriculture, given that it is mentioned separate to food processing, and also light vehicles. So it is not the most developed city we could say in China, and probably not the first place that you'd think of when choosing a place to build satellites. That being said, my suspicion is that Qiansheng did not necessarily choose Fuzhou so much as Fuzhou may have chosen Qiansheng. And what I mean by this is, as we've discussed in previous episodes, many Chinese commercial space companies have partnered with local or provincial governments in some way, with the government providing tax incentives or other financial assistance, and with the space company locating to that city or province and setting up their factory or other operations. And so if we look at the other Chinese commercial satellite manufacturers that have paired up with other cities, they have paired up with relatively more developed cities. So, for example, we saw Galaxy Space building their satellite superfactory in Nantong in Jiangsu province, which is one of the more developed provinces in China. We saw Comsat building factories in Yibin and Tangshan, which are admittedly not as developed as Nantong, but still very close to Chengdu and Beijing, respectively. And so I think as these companies have partnered with some of the more desirable cities, the cities that are left that are really keen on developing a space or satellite industry infrastructure are getting to be somewhat fewer and further between, you could say. And so, my speculation is that, Qiansheng Exploration, being one of the sort of second generation of Chinese commercial satellite manufacturers, they may have been, this was maybe one of their fewer choices. It's also entirely possible that Fuzhou, Jiangxi is perhaps one of the, hometowns of one of the founders, or there's some other connection like that. We don't really know. But either way, interesting to see Qiansheng Exploration tying up with the Fuzhou City Development Fund and probably moving some of their operations to Fuzhou City, Jiangxi. So probably good news for the real estate market, because I would imagine Qiansheng Exploration employees are probably better paid than the average person in Fuzhou. So yeah, Jean, anything from your side on this? Are you when are you going to Fuzhou now? Are you planning to go check it out at some point, or still no plan?
Well, yeah. When I saw you mention during the preparation of the episode Fuzhou, Jiangxi, so I am not aware of much space industry in Jiangxi, so I sort of Googled, or rather Baidu'd that up, and you always have an institute of CASC or CASIC, not too far from any place in China, basically. And indeed, I landed on a subsidiary of CASIC Cloud in Jiangxi, in Nanchang, the capital of the province. And it was interesting that the subsidiary of CASIC Cloud that was there was actually also a subsidiary that was co-invested by CASIC Cloud, obviously, but also by the Jiangxi Investment Fund Corporation. So also it's a similar configuration to what we see for Qiansheng, where there's the municipal government or the provincial government that's pitching in order to attract some technology into, some tech company into the province. So that's the first point. And now going back to Qiansheng, I think Qiansheng Exploration is a really good a topic in general to illustrate this growing trend that we see in the Earth observation sector, where we have some, not all, but some companies really verticalizing. That means, like, for example, Qiansheng, they're building constellations. They have 3 planned, Qiansheng 1, 2 planned, and Qiansheng 3 mentioned in some recent interviews. They're also designing and building the satellites of this constellation. They're also building a network of ground stations, as you hinted at a little bit. They already have 2 that are operational today for TT&C and for a data downlink. They are also, building a cloud infrastructure, although I suspect that's with a partner. And ultimately, they're also developing their own analytics software to provide to their customers. So that's really a lot of things that they're doing at the same time. And so I think that this round of funding that you're mentioning, it's really not surprising, especially when you take into account that, first they have to fund so many things. And secondly, when you look at their previous rounds of funding, they all go back to 2018. They had an angel round, they had a pre-A and a pre-A, what they called pre-A1, all in 2018. So it's been, nearly 2.5 years since their last inflow of cash. So it really makes sense based on what they're trying to build from a technological point of view. And maybe just one last thing that I want to mention here is that Qiansheng Exploration, they are one of the satellite companies that have already launched a satellite into space. So comparatively, maybe to Comsat or other companies, there are quite fewer satellites. I think for Qiansheng Exploration, there's mainly one. It was the Qiansheng 1 satellite that was launched on August 2019. But yeah, this round of funding probably means that things are going to move a bit faster in the upcoming months or years. And maybe as a transition to our next point, the Qiansheng 1 satellite was launched on a Jielong-1 rocket. And speaking of Jielong, we also had an interesting announcement this week from CALT's commercial subsidiary called China Rocket, who announced that the Jielong-3 rocket would have its maiden launch in 2022, so 1 year from now. And just some background on Jielong-3. Jielong-3 is, well, it's the third and the heaviest rocket of the solid-fueled Jielong family that they're developing. It puts 1.5 tons, I believe, into, I think it's low Earth orbit. And so that's much more than, say, Jielong-1, which puts 200 kilograms into SSO, I believe, sun-synchronous orbit, or the Jielong-2, which puts 500 kilograms into SSO. Jielong-1 being the only rocket so far of the Jielong family that's actually made an orbital launch successfully. Now, a little background on the Jielong family. As far as I know, Jielong-2 and Jielong-3 were announced in a China Rocket event in October 2019. So let's put ourselves back at that date. Back in the days, China Rocket had just launched the Jielong-1, and that was the only rocket that we knew about. And so they already had a foot in the commercial launch sector, but the announcement in October 2019 during their event really showed that they were planning to really anchor themselves into this small lift commercial launch sector and really compete with potentially their competitors such as X-Space from KSIC, but also other commercial launch companies. And we know that they have a lot of similar payloads. And another interesting point at this conference back in October 2019 is that they announced the Tenglong liquid-fueled medium-lift launch vehicles, and which would come after the Jielong. And what's interesting here is that we see them sort of following the same path than a lot of the other private commercial companies, which, there's this philosophy of solid first, liquid second. And well, it seems that China Rocket is also following a similar path. And last point also of interest on this announcement on Jielong-3 this week is that the announcement was on Jielong-3, and there was nothing on Jielong-2. And when you look at the table that they showed at their event in 2019, it seemed that the Jielong rockets would be developed sequentially, Jielong-1, then 2, then 3. And so we're having a maiden launch of Jielong-3 next year with no word absolutely on Jielong-2. So, I mean, maybe this means that China Rocket is setting aside the Jielong-2. We don't really know that. But if they did, it would make some sense. I mean, we had a discussion in episode 6 of Dongfang Hour with Kevin Xu of Landspace, and he did indicate that specific segment of the launch industry is extremely crowded, solid-fueled, small lift launch vehicles. And that is also why Landspace put aside their Zhuqiu-1 rocket for now, because it's just getting too competitive, and you can't make much money out of this specific segment. So anyway, really nice update, interesting update from China Rocket this week on their Jielong family. It does raise a lot of questions, more than answers some questions. But again, a new development in a very dynamic launch landscape in China.
Very dynamic, and as you said, very crowded. So this is probably not good news for any commercial company hoping to address the small or medium lift solid launch market in China. But yeah, definitely an interesting announcement. Just to give a little bit of context from my side. So as you briefly alluded to, so China Rocket is a commercial subsidiary of CALT, which CALT is, of course, the main launch subsidiary of CASC. And so in this way, China Rocket is very similar to X-Space, with X-Space, of course, being the similarly commercial subsidiary of KSIC. And X-Space over the last several years has seen quite a lot of success in the development of its Kuaizhou 1A rockets, and the company has shown an interesting blend of traditional space industry technology chops, which are largely inherited from KSIC, and quite a lot of resources also from KSIC, combining this with some commercial space industry flair. Obviously, probably the most noteworthy example being the live online auction last year by X-Space of a Kuaizhou rocket that fetched them about $5 million US. So again, this is one of those things which you have a commercial subsidiary of a state-owned company, which has the kind of best of both worlds element of lots of resources from the parent SOE, but the ability to move a little bit more freely and to do things a little bit more creatively. And so getting back to China Rocket, this is, I presume, the primary reason that CALT is investing in China Rocket is because they would like to have their own kind of nimbler, more flexible commercial launch subsidiary. And that can be fine. That makes sense. That being said, I believe another part of the China rocket story in general, and of the Jielong-3 announcement more specifically, is that CASC and CALT are probably not very happy about X-Space existing. And this kind of gets into, the mindset of state-owned companies in China, and also to a certain extent, the mindset of the government more generally, in the sense that, they say in poker that the house always wins, and that there's the house and there's everyone else. And in China, the government is basically the house, and state-owned enterprises are also basically the house. And they don't particularly like having competitors in their very kind of monopolistic or oligopolistic industries. And so in the case of CALT and China Rocket, I do think that X-Space and the Kuaizhou rockets have been developing very quickly and been very kind of flashy, doing interesting commercial things. And this has been perceived, rightly or wrongly, by CALT as a threat to them and a threat to their business. And so I think that this, increased investment into China Rocket, or I guess, well, we didn't hear about increased investment, but, the implied increased investment by the Jielong-3 program being green-lighted, in addition to just the Jielong-3 program itself, this is an indication, I think, that China Rocket is, if not concerned about X-Space, they would like to stomp out X-Space sooner rather than later. And I think that this is probably implied by the extent to which the specifications of the Jielong-3 are very similar to X-Space's Kuaizhou 11 small to medium lift rocket, which suffered a launch failure in its inaugural launch in July of last year. So again, it's a little bit of speculation on my part, but I do think that the primary reason for CASC and CALT to be pushing forward with development of Jielong-3 and China Rocket in general is this idea that CASC has this broad monopoly in the space sector, and there are certain parts of that monopoly that are starting to open up to a little bit of commercialization, so like small to medium lift rockets. And rather than allowing that commercialization to happen and just let it go, CASC is seemingly very keen on maintaining as much of their monopoly as they can. And that's a fair, I mean, it's an understandable reaction. But I do think that it begs the question of, is this really worth it for CASC and CALT? Is this the best use of CASC and CALT's limited resources? Do they really need to develop multiple commercial solid-fueled rockets to compete with any and all potential, CASIC or commercial rockets? I honestly don't know. I don't have exceptionally good insights into the resource allocation of CASC. But when we take a step back and look at all of the things that CASC is tasked with doing over these next few years, that would be including the Chinese space station, the Mars missions, the Chang'e missions, the large LEO broadband constellation that's coming in relatively soon. All of these very big the Long March 9 that we just heard about, all of these huge projects that are CASC does not have enough people to do. I mean, they have far too many things going on at one time. Is it really worth then spending their relatively limited resources on a commercial rocket that does not really address any of these big projects that I just mentioned? Like, I don't think that any of the, Chang'e or Chinese, none of these are going to use the Jielong-3. It really just seems like CASC and CALT are using some of their relatively limited, we could call financial and human resources ammunition on a market and a problem that just doesn't really seem all that important. Because honestly, at the end of the day, X-Space and the Kuaizhou 1A and the Kuaizhou 11, they may indeed be competitive with certain CALT rockets for certain markets, but X-Space is not anywhere close to being a sort of full-scale competitor to CALT in any way, shape, or form. I mean, this is not, it's really, and so again, it just becomes a question of, is this really the best use of CALT's limited resources? Just to take an example off the top of my head, if we're thinking about other areas of commercial space where CALT might be wanting to invest, I would say there's a pretty big absence of SATCOM application type companies in China. A lot of them exist, but like if you look at the satellite broadband internet market in China, now granted the terrestrial connectivity is excellent, but China Satcom has been trying to develop Ka-band broadband solutions for China for a long time. and they have not really succeeded. And I don't know if insufficient resources is a reason for that, but I would venture to say if CASC was looking for, ways to grow their business overall through having relatively small investments in commercial elements of the space sector, they would probably be better off investing in things other than small to medium size solid rockets just to spite Kasich and X-Base. This is my 2 cents. And again, I don't work for CASC, nor do I have great visibility into what they are doing. But just top of my head, this does not make a lot of sense in my opinion, because I really do think that CASC has a lot of stuff on their plate already. So now that I'm banned from ever entering China again because I've just questioned the almighty knowledge and wisdom of CASC, Jean, anything else from your side on the Jielong-3, or shall we move into the article from the Beijing Daily?
Yeah, let's move on to the Beijing Daily, and this article actually gives some extra insights, I think, on our discussion on Jielong. So the Beijing Daily published this week an article on Beijing's commercial space ecosystem. There was no big scoop, there was no big announcement, but it was a good discussion. I think it's just a great excuse to bring up again how the Beijing government and how just municipal governments and provincial governments in China can support the Chinese growing private sector in space. And so first thing before going into that, I'd just like to mention that Beijing is really the undeniable capital of Chinese commercial space. This is in terms of numbers of companies, commercial companies that are incorporated in Beijing. And secondly, it's also in terms of investment. We have a lot of big space investors that are based in Beijing. And actually, this just goes beyond space. This is really the case in general. When you look at tech, a lot of the big VCs in mainland China, at least, are situated in Beijing. Now this is said. I think the most interesting part of this article by the Beijing Daily is how, first of all, it brings up a sort of geography divide between the north and the south of Beijing. In the north of Beijing, you have a lot of the satellite manufacturers, whereas in the south, you have all the launch companies, commercial launch companies that are clustered together. And this really brings the question of why is that the case? And so the Beijing Daily, they bring up notably the main reason, which is that CAL, the main state-owned launch company of China, is situated, well, a lot of their facilities are situated in the south of Beijing. And CAST, CAST, which is the main satellite manufacturer, state-owned one of China, is situated in the north. And so this suggests that there's quite a bit of, at least that's my takeaway, is that there's quite a bit of collaboration between the commercial companies and the state-owned companies, may it be launch or may it be satellite manufacturing. And I think this also brings an extra nuance to what we were saying on the Jielong just now, as definitely there is competition between the launch companies, but at the same time, you see that they're clustered together in the south and that there is some sort of collaboration as well, and a lot of interaction between the companies. So I think this is where we touch a little bit the complexity of the Chinese space ecosystem, where everyone basically are frenemies, and there's this co-petition going on between the different companies. So I think that's the first interesting point from the Beijing Daily article that was interesting. The second one is how municipal governments support the Chinese space industry. And we've discussed it in the past, in past episodes. One of the main ways they can do this is through bringing land and through bringing facilities. And in Beijing, that's definitely the case. The article discusses the Zhongguancun area, and Blaine, you mentioned that a little bit just now. And so definitely a lot of tech-heavy companies, including space tech, that are clustered there. You also have, in the article, they announced that the Beijing municipality would be building what they call a commercial aerospace industry based in the most southern district of Beijing called Daxing. So that probably, again, means land, facilities, cheap lease of offices to Chinese space companies. And so, yeah, first land, facilities, this sort of support, but they also mentioned direct financial investment. And that's what we've seen also discussed in past episodes. And the Beijing Daily mentions that the Beijing government is reaching out to a lot of the municipal industry funds to be able to bring significant amounts of money, investment into these commercial space companies that are based in Beijing. So that's the second point. And the third point, which is one I admittedly hadn't thought of previously, is that, well, the Beijing municipality apparently is also setting up mechanisms to limit insurance premiums for commercial space companies. And this is really consistent with the Beijing space ecosystem, because you have a lot of the launch companies that are there, and definitely insurance premiums for first launches of first rockets, that is bound to be quite some expensive insurance premiums. And so I guess this is a great way also to help these commercial launch companies attract first talents. Their first customers. So yeah, really a wide portrait that's drawn here of how local governments support the space industry. And so here it's specifically Beijing, but I think what is said here can, to a very large extent, be generalized to just all of the first-tier municipalities in China, Shenzhen, Shanghai, and even Chengdu, etc. All these cities,
and possibly one day Fuzhou, maybe one day even Fuzhou. Yeah. So a couple of things to unpack from your point. Then I have some fun little anecdotes. So the frenemies aspect, and I'm gonna get back to a second for CASC as well here. So I take your point that the commercial companies and say CASC and or CASIC, they are frenemies in the sense that CASC has, I don't think they feel very threatened by any of the commercial companies, not nearly to the extent that they feel threatened by CASIC. And CASIC likewise feels, so I think there's an obvious, and also these commercial companies, they're building technologies oftentimes that CASC would like. And so there's a certain degree of, if Landspace builds a liquid methalox rocket engine that is fitted for a rocket with a 3.35 meter diameter, that's probably okay for CASC. So that is true. But I do think that CASC and CASIC, they may or may not be frenemies. I think they're more like sworn enemies who would most certainly slit the throat of the other if they had the chance. And so this is where I think it gets kind of interesting. So it's one point, is that I don't know it. I could be wrong. Maybe they are, in fact. I think I actually did write an article once calling CASC and CASIC the best frenemies ever, so I'm going to eat my hat on that one. But I don't think they're frenemies. I think they hate each other. But again, I take your point that CASC and the commercial companies are definitely frenemies. Likewise are CASIC and the commercial companies. So that's one point, my little speculation, and again, watch me eat my hat on that one. But the other point about this collaboration between the SOEs and the commercial companies that directly relates to the Beijing article and the Nanjian Beijing, the building rockets in the south and satellites in the north, is so my last trip to Beijing, which was about a year and a half ago, I recall in the very southern part of the city, going to the Landspace headquarters to visit Landspace. And Landspace's headquarters is located in what is called AVIC Plaza. Now, for those of you who don't know, AVIC, the Aerospace Industry Corporation of China, is that AVIC?
I think it's aviation.
Aviation. Well, yeah, it's a good, yeah, it would be, yeah, the V would, yeah, aerospace has no V in it. Okay, good. The aviation industry of China, yes, anyway, AVIC, big SOE. They have this large, AVIC Plaza in the south of Beijing. And when I say large, I mean it's one of the enormous real estate development. And Landspace has an entire 5-story building in this AVIC Plaza. And I don't know what Landspace is paying for rent. I don't know what the market rent is in that part of Beijing. But I would not be that surprised if Landspace was getting a reasonably good deal from AVIC on this big piece of property. And so, again, I mean, this relates to it was very much, they were building their rockets in the south. And again, they were definitely collaborating with AVIC in some way here, at least from a real estate perspective. The other trip that I took on that trip was to go visit ComSat up in the north, and they were building satellites up in the north. And they too, I mean, they were located in a sort of Chinese Academy of Sciences military civil fusion industrial park type of thing. And so again, this is, I guess not necessarily SOEs, but the Chinese Academy of Sciences, kind of acting as a support mechanism for these commercial companies and allowing them to probably limit their overhead and have other, benefits that could just help this company stay nimble and stay alive for longer, because as we know, it is very hard to kill Chinese space companies. So yeah, I think certainly this is, it's an interesting article, and they bring up a lot of true points that we have found in real life. I guess the other point that sticks out about the article is it's certainly just a commentary on the diversity and the size of Beijing's space ecosystem, to have such a policy as, we have to build rockets over here and build satellites over here. Because, I mean, for those who have not been, Beijing is a mind-bogglingly huge city. And so to a certain extent, you can understand why you'd want the government to consolidate or to concentrate industries in certain areas. If you were trying to work with a company and they were on the other side of Beijing, you're looking at a few hour one-way trip sometimes. And so, yeah, again, this idea of needing this degree of geographical specificity, I think, is really just a commentary on how huge the city of Beijing is, and also on just how I guess, diverse and large the space industry is. And again, just going back to my most recent trip to Beijing all those months ago, I mean, there were times where I was with a client on this trip. We were visiting some of their clients, and every single day we were spending 2 or 3 hours per day in the car. And that was with my having set up the meetings in a way that was geographically convenient. It could have been 5 hours had we, gone all over town. And so, again, you just have such a large city with so many space companies and so many companies that it certainly makes sense to basically give some degree of order to the chaos that is Beijing. So yeah, overall, very big space sector in Beijing, a lot of stuff going on, and a lot of moving pieces, and it definitely makes me miss the northern capital, as Beijing is, as is the Chinese translation for the name Beijing. So yeah, that's anything else from your side, John, or are we about good on this week's episode?
I'm good.
Excellent. Well, there were about 16 other news updates this week that we did not get to, so we will, we'll try to tweet some of those out or otherwise interact on some of those later on. We might put some in the show notes as well. But yeah, in the meantime, this has been another episode of the Dongfang Hour China Aerospace and Space News Roundup. I'm Blaine Curcio, joined as always by my co-host Jean Deville. We will see you next week. I will be in this very same exact spot. I may or may not have shaved by then, so we'll have to see. But in the meantime, thank you very much for joining, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thanks for watching. Bye.